Hello and welcome to the October 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and I'm very pleased to have as our guest this month journalist and author Thomas Frank, whose most recent book, Know the People, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, shows the origins of American populism lie not in the far right, but the radical left of the 1890s. Taking the long view, as Thomas Frank habitually does, may be especially valuable now, with the political atmosphere so febrile, and as he puts it in his article in this month's issue, a growing feeling that no one really knows what the hell is going on. Nothing can be verified, the exasperated mayor of Kansas City recently told a journalist. Kansas City happens to be where Thomas grew up, and where he spent the past summer in his childhood home, taking stock of national and global events. I spoke to him at the end of a turbulent week, even by 2020 standards. We'd had the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden, the New York Times revelations about Trump's meagre to non-existent tax payments, and then early on the day we spoke, the news of Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis. Our conversation was, I suppose, an attempt to set some of those events in wider context, to look beyond the fear complexes and predictions of the end of democracy, the pageants of panic played out at the Democratic and Republican conventions. I began by asking Thomas about his suburban Kansas City summer, registering the shocks of the daily news.
It was shocking, and it was a new shock every day. And where I was staying is a very pleasant suburb of Kansas City. And I was, obviously staying with my dad, who's retired. So it's not like he has anything he has to do. And I was sort of on vacation. I had to write this story, but I didn't have anything that I had to do. And so we would have these very pleasant days, and I would cook something for dinner. We'd watch TV, and I would read a novel. It's, by the way, the house I grew up in. So I was reading a lot of novels that I enjoyed when I was young, long ago. And I would ride my bike around the neighborhood. It's a very beautiful part of the city. And it's made more so by the fact that there's almost no traffic on the streets because of COVID. And this is a part of the city where there's ordinarily lots of crews of garden workers going around in trucks and working on people's lawns. And for whatever reason, that has disappeared during the pandemic, and with the result being that there's nobody on the streets at all. And so I would ride around this absolutely beautiful neighborhood. There was a garden where the flowers were in bloom, and they were incredibly fragrant. And it was like I was the only person in the world. And then I'd come back to the house, pick up the newspaper from the driveway, bring it inside, turn on the computer, open up Twitter, and boom, it would be this shock to be back in the sort of shared world of news and panic and anger every single day. And it succeeded in shocking me almost every single day, because I made a routine of this, right? I'd get up in the morning, I'd get on my bike, I'd ride around. It would be so beautiful. This would happen every single day. Yeah.
Your piece, I guess, is sort of taking the mood of the country, isn't it? It's reflecting on recent events and things which have fed into it. How did you manage, to put the pieces together?
Well, insofar as that's even possible. The thing is, I don't know if that can even be done anymore.
Yes.
It's the mood of the country as it's expressed by the only sort of common area that we have left, which is social media, which is just absolutely dreadful. And I think is leading to, everybody's talking about the sort of the depression, and there's a lot of sort of really deep-seated unhappiness in America today. I imagine the same is true in the UK. A lot of that, I think, is a reflection of the sort of the fact that social media has taken over our lives. And so while that has happened, and so I'm sort of comparing reality, which is quite pleasant, to then this awful other reality that I would open up on my computer that you would see in the newspaper, which is all about panic these days. And then there's this other weird thing when you're in a place like Kansas City, which is not Washington, where I am now, and is not New York City. And that is that you really have no idea what is going on. just a few miles away from you.
Yes.
Because the local news has completely collapsed, or not completely. I mean, there's a remnant of it, the local newspaper, but it's a shadow of its former self. So I grew up there, like I say, and when I was young, the Kansas City newspaper was one of the great newspapers of America, the Kansas City Star. And today it's like all regional newspapers, it's fallen on extremely hard times, with the result being that you don't, there is a sense of the inability to understand or to know what's going on around us that's reflected in the pages of the paper itself. And I tried to give some sense of that. This simultaneous panic and fear driven by the coronavirus epidemic and social media, and then simultaneously this sense that you just have no idea what's going on.
I wanted to maybe reflect on some recent events in the sort of wider context of your piece in Le Monde Diplomatique, but even by the standards of this year, it has been a very eventful week. We're talking on the 2nd of October. And I wanted to start first with the presidential debate, the first of the presidential debates, which happened,
I think, the first and the last.
On Tuesday. Well, yes, quite. We'll come on. Well, I'm sure we'll come on to that too. I mean, when I woke up the next morning, because it was on too late to watch it in the UK, my feeling was that Trump had succeeded in kind of bringing Biden down into, to wrestling in the mud, and he had sort of so debased the whole format of the debate, and that really was, in a sense, a success for him, because he had sort of suffocated the possibility, and that sort of plays into this notion that Trump is so debasing democracy that he is, in a sense, sort of pre-fascist, if you like. And I wondered what your sense of that was, maybe through the optic of that debate.
There's a lot of reasons to think that Trump is a sort of a pre-fascist. I hadn't thought of that as a particular reason. More like the way that he made that remark about the Proud Boys, who are definitely pre-fascist. Yeah. That was kind of shocking. I watched the debate, and I was ashamed that this happened in my country. It was truly shocking. It was reprehensible. I felt nothing but absolute contempt for Trump and what he was doing, and sympathy for Biden. Look, I hate bullies. I can't stand bullies, and that was a form of bullying that it was loathsome to behold. Now, on the other hand, I also mistrust my own instincts on these things. Look, I'm a journalist. Your instincts are never the last word on these things, and you have to think about it and mull it over. But I suspect that the public is with me on this one, that they felt very sorry for Joe Biden. I was also somewhat proud of him. I'm not a big Biden supporter. I'm fond of the guy as a human. Everybody here in Washington likes Joe Biden, but I don't agree with him on very many things. He's a conservative Democrat, and I'm pretty far to the left. But I was proud of him for standing up to that storm of abuse, even cutting through it every now and then. Now, granted, he didn't really say anything memorable. He didn't get any good points across, and it totally ruined any opportunity that he might have had to make good points against Trump. And in fact, Trump sabotaged a debate that was actually going fairly well for him. I thought he made some excellent points now and then, but his behavior was just so petulant and childish that it's impossible, to feel kindly toward him in any way. That's the feeling that I came away from. You wonder what he said that I thought was okay. I thought it was very interesting. Biden, as I said, is a conservative Democrat and has a long history in this town. And back in the 80s and the 90s, Biden was persistently one of the big champions of these law and order measures that would come up in Congress, where they were forever jacking up the sentences that drug users had, the sentences that they would get for prison time, 3 strikes laws, maximum, or what do they call them, mandatory minimums. I mean, terrible, terrible things. I mean, there's a reason that the U.S. has such an enormous part of its population in prison, and it's because of those laws that Joe Biden either supported or actually wrote back in the 80s and 90s. And Biden has, in my view has a lot to answer for with those laws. I've written about this in other places at great length. Trump actually started to go after him for it, which was, that was amazing because Trump is, presenting himself as the friend of the police and the champion of law and order and everything. And here he was attacking Biden for that. That was a really interesting move. But of course, it didn't mean anything. It's just Trump, he'll say anything. He'll literally say anything. And a focus group somewhere told him this was a good thing to say. And so he said it. It meant nothing. But at first I thought I was kind of intrigued.
You write in your article, Thomas, about Trump comes out with billows of bullshit, but amidst those billows are tiny kernels of truth. And I wondered, can you say what you had in mind there? Were there instances of that you thought sort of hit home on the debate?
Not really. That it was so confused and so awful that I found nothing really, interesting or insightful uttered by either one of them. But if you go back and look at the Republican convention, and if you look at the speech that Trump gave and the speech that his daughter gave, Ivanka, and there's, by the way, these are layered, many, many layers of irony on this. I should just take a step back here. One of the traditional, the sort of traditional alignment of the political parties in America, the Democrats, for all my life, have identified themselves as, they have this phrase, they call themselves the party of the people. And they identify themselves with the aspirations of the middle class, which is an American euphemism for the working class. They talk about the Social Security and we don't have much of a welfare state here in America, but what we do have, the Democratic Party is identified with, and it used to be a point of pride for them. This was who they were. This was their brand identity, if you will. And they didn't talk about that at all in their convention this time around, which was astonishing. And then equally astonishing was the fact that the Republican Party picked it up and ran with it, this sort of discarded brand identity of the Democrats. And Ivanka Trump, in her speech introducing her dad, by the way, which was also visually a really interesting speech, she went out of her way to identify her dad as the champion of middle-class aspirations and of specifically of blue-collar workers, in a really outrageous way, especially considering that he's a billionaire and she's, his daughter and has been raised in the trappings of wealth and luxury and is married to another, her dad's a New York, real estate guy, and she's married to another real New York real estate guy. That's the world she lives in, and as far as I know, has never departed from. And here she is hailing her dad as this great savior of the working class. And then Trump himself went into it at high volume, as he does. And he talked about how he's angered big pharma and how the elite of this country hate him. And again, it's bullshit. Trump has done very, very little for these voters, for these sort of aggrieved blue collar voters. But the kernel of truth to it is that their grievances are real. And they have been ignored by our two-party system here in America. They've sort of been read out of the reform program here in America. And when Trump says they, meaning the elite, hate me because I'm on your side or because I fight for you or whatever the hell it is, no, he hasn't really done a whole lot for these people. But it is true that the elite hates him. They hate his guts. And it reminded me, and I hate to say this because I don't like Donald Trump very much, but and I'm going to compare him to one of my great heroes, who's Franklin Roosevelt. When Roosevelt was running for re-election in 1936, the elite of this country came together against him in an unprecedented way, a sort of unanimity among tycoons, corporation lawyers, businessmen of all descriptions, professionals, and the economists, of course, and the media, the newspaper publishers of the time. They hated him, absolutely hated him. They came together against him in a really remarkable way. I've written about this also somewhere else at great length. And Roosevelt, a very famous speech, he described this coalition that had come together against him. And he said, they're out of power, because you put me here, and they want their power back. And he said, now they're engaged in this this is not a direct quote, of course, but this is close. They're engaged in this incredible campaign of hate and vilification against me, and I welcome their hatred. And it was one of Roosevelt's, really stirring great moments where he welcomed this antagonistic system. And that's what Trump did. Also, now Trump is no Roosevelt. Trump has done very, very, very little for these people, but he does have the hate of that elite group. That is true. He's right about that.
So when you read 3 or 4 op-eds in the New York Times every day attacking some aspect of Trump or telling you why he spells the end of democracy, that gives Trump something to push back against, doesn't it? And it reinforces his narrative that you've just described, that he is sort of not of that world and standing up against that world.
Because of the what we were talking about before, the death of regional newspapers in America. And this, by the way, is across the board, all over the country. Even the big ones, like the Chicago Tribune, which was once one of the mightiest newspapers. They had a slogan. They called themselves the world's greatest newspaper. Well, today, they're like everybody else. They're down to a fraction of their former self. They had to sell their famous office building in Chicago. It's apartments now. Because of the death of all these other newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post are all that's left. I mean, there's the Wall Street Journal also, but that's... for complicated reasons, that doesn't have the impact that the other two do. And the Post and the Times set the agenda for the rest of the mass media. The TV news takes all their cues from those guys. For my liberal friends, that's how they understand the world, is through the New York Times and the Washington Post. These papers have... they are openly tilting the news against Trump. They'll call him a liar in the headlines. The Washington Post is a running tally of what they call Trump's lies, a lot of which are just, Trump will misstate something. I mean, a lot of them are truly falsehoods. The man is an incredible, he'll just say anything. But any reader can see when they call things lies that are clearly misstatements or just simple exaggerations. Any reader can see what he's up against. And they can see it when they watch CNN or when they watch MSNBC, and they can see it on the other side with Fox News. This world has come unmoored from what we always expected when we grew up in this country, that they would play it straight and they would at least try to be, neutral and sort of objective about the news. Everyone can see that. They can also see that these outlets speak for very wealthy people. The Times and the Post in particular are, overwhelmingly, let's say, staffed by graduates of very prestigious universities. And it comes through in their writing and their frame of reference, the way they quote experts all the time. Everything about them screams social class, which in America, by the way, you're it's considered uncouth to point that out, but it's true. And they're class outlets, they're class newspapers. Well, you have the same thing in the UK. As they have radicalized themselves, so has this sort of slice of the upper middle class. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So I'm in Bethesda, Maryland. Okay. And it's a very affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. A lot of lobbyists live around here, a lot of people with advanced degrees. My neighborhood is like more than 50% people with advanced degrees. And we're not near a university or anything. That's the white collar class in this country. And they're overwhelmingly Democratic now. Oh, didn't used to be. They used to be Republicans, but now this area is overwhelmingly Democratic. And if you go around the neighborhood and it's dotted with these McMansions, you know what I mean by it? You know what this is? Yes. These instant mansions that they build. They're all over the place now. And I'm going to do a photographic essay about this one of these days. They all have these yard signs. This is very popular yard sign that lists all of the liberal causes, all the causes that these people imagine to be their causes. And the idea of the yard sign is that it lists everything. It's comprehensive. And so it says Black Lives Matter, and it says women's rights are human rights, and it says science is real, and no human is illegal, or something like that. And then, like something about water. They want clean water. I forget what. And what always gets me every time I see one of these signs is they don't mention labor. Right. They don't mention workers. Right. They don't mention, income inequality. They don't mention taxation. They don't mention the minimum wage. And this at a time when, working class people are just the floor is dropped out from under them. And this is so crazy. But when you talk to this kind of liberal, they will present themselves as extremely radical. when talking about certain subjects. And if you bring up the subject of labor, they will not know what you're talking about. If you talk about unions or you talk about the workplace or any of that stuff, or they will not know what you're talking about. They don't know that that is part of the tradition of being on the left. They're unaware of that. And that's America. That's where we are now. I mentioned the Democratic Convention that somehow neglected to mention the middle class. And that's where we are. And it is just the craziest time. It is the craziest thing.
Hillary Clinton famously described the Trumpian base as the basket of deplorables.
Yeah.
Which said something quite profound, I think, about the Democratic Party's top echelon's attitude. Is that something that you think the Democratic Party has addressed in those intervening 4 years, or do you think there's still a...
No, it's the other way around. I have to tell you, George, I wrote a book that came out earlier this year, and I've got a whole chapter about that. Hillary is a smart politician, and she knew she had made a terrible misstep as soon as she uttered those words, and she tried to back out of it. She tried to get away from it. Everybody who heard that knew what she was talking about them, working class people, and their bad manners and their uncouth ways. They knew she was talking about them, and they resented it. And it was a terrible mistake, and she knew it. She tried to get out of it. What's fascinating is that liberal commentators, what I call the pundit bureau, because they all do everything alike, right? The pundit bureau in this country grabbed onto that with both hands and said, that is exactly right. They are deplorables. And liberalism is a quality of highly educated people. Liberalism is something that, that is a quality of people like us who went to good schools and who understand that you respect science and you believe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And they have doubled down on this in a kind of a shocking way. They've made that denouncing the lower orders. That's what liberalism is in America. For example, it is absolutely common. This assumption is absolutely commonplace that what ails working class people is that they are racist, or white working class people anyway. They insist on defining the lower orders as reprehensible in this way. And it's not borne out by the data. In fact, white collar people, upper class people are also racist. There's a long history of this in America. And it's not as simple as that. It's not like, the poorer you get, the more racist you are. That is actually not correct. But they believe it. And the result is that you have this situation where the sort of professional white collar class, this new American elite that comes out of the good university, the fancy, I don't want to say good, lots of universities are good. They come out of the fancy, Ivy League colleges, and they're doing extremely well economically. This is a heaven on earth sort of time for them. All of the growth in the economy goes to this little cohort of people, but they're not just richer than everybody else. They're better. This is what they believe. They're more moral. They're more enlightened. They're less bigoted. They're better people. They're not just richer. They're better people. That is a really fascinating recipe. Well, I guess every upper class all through history has always considered itself to be the superior. I mean, you're in England. You know about this.
Yes. Oh, yes. I said this had been a big week for news even by 2020 standards. The New York Times midweek broke the story of Donald Trump's taxis. And I wondered if we could talk about that within the context of who is still undecided in the United States. I mean, it seems to me quite striking or quite surprising that anybody could be undecided at this stage in the game, but apparently there are some people who are undecided. So does the tax story make any difference to those? I mean, who do you think those people are who are undecided, and what do you think is in their mind beyond the tax story? But what kind of person is still undecided, and what might they be weighing up 4 weeks before the election?
Well, I don't know who's undecided, but I know who what they call the swing voters, people who have, in the course of our lifetimes, have changed their partisan allegiance and have, changed the political landscape. There's two big groups. One is the sort of suburban, these white collar professionals that we're talking about, who, when I was a child, were all Republicans, and today have switched completely to the other side. The other group, which outnumbers them enormously, is the white working class who have gone the other direction. When I was a child, were Democrats, and who are in the process of becoming Republicans. And I've been writing about that for years. And I assume that this news would would make them reconsider voting for Donald Trump. This news about him only paying $750 in taxes, because I guarantee you every single one of them pays a lot more than that. I mean, that does infuriate me. I pay a lot of taxes every year, and that pisses me off that a guy like him pays so very, very little. It's massively annoying. It's also it doesn't surprise me, because I've read a lot about his life, that he's succeeded in losing so much money, all of his business deals, that he's able to, that's why he doesn't pay any tax, is because he's entered into such terrible deals. That doesn't surprise me, but I imagine there are some people out there still who are shocked to learn that he's actually not a particularly good businessman.
But do you think all of that is sort of priced in voting for Donald Trump? So much of this is already known, so much of it has been gone over in such great detail that really nobody is under any illusions who's going to cast a vote for him.
I think that's right. We already had strong suggestions that this was the case back in 2016. There was one aspect of it that was kind of interesting that I thought about. I mean, there are lots of aspects. It's all forgotten, by the way. Now, I went on Twitter this morning. They've all moved on.
Right. I can imagine what they've moved on to.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a second. But anyhow, the whole Russiagate thing. So for 2 years, the media in this country, their universal topic of obsessive topic was that Donald Trump was in some way a Russian agent, and the collusion, and he was under Putin's control, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems to have completely evaporated. And the last sort of missing piece of this puzzle was his taxes, where you would have been able to see any payments made by the Soviets, but it wasn't there. So that's the end of that. What's funny is, that's a very interesting little chapter in American life, because the entire media, I never wrote about it. I never wrote about Russiagate because I never had anything interesting to say about it. It always seemed unlikely to me. And, I don't know any people in the national security apparatus who could leak some juicy piece of evidence to me. I don't know anybody like that. So I never wrote about it. But what's funny is that everybody else in the American journalism did. Every single one. Now it's just like they've dropped it. Now move on to the next. Move on to the next thing.
And as you alluded to, we woke up this morning to Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis, and in the course of the day I've seen speculation on Twitter that he was deliberately infected at the presidential debate, or that he's faking it. And
well, I wonder if he was already sick. I mean, that might explain his behavior with Biden. I mean, he was rabid. It was crazy. His behavior was just, so when he debated Hillary Clinton, he was bad, and he was ill-mannered. And he did mutter things into the microphone, remember? He would interrupt her with like a really cruel remark or something like that. But he didn't do it constantly. Something's gone wrong with him between that time and this. And I wonder if what do I know? I don't know. I'm sorry. But you were saying something about him and COVID, where he contracted it. I have no idea.
I was simply saying, it's already generated a huge amount of speculation on, from both extremes of him faking it to him having been deliberately infected, and I'm sure there are all sorts of other positions in the middle. Yeah. But I suppose I'm saying we are in a political climate, a social media climate, in which those things take off like wildfire, and they just run and run. And so it's another, I guess, anarchic element that's been thrown into an already anarchic situation.
I know. And by the way, there's no way to write about this in the classic journalistic mode, you can tweet about it. You can come up with mean things on Twitter and keep up with it that way. But the only way to think about what's going on now, I think, is in the terms of the long-term changes in American politics. And that's what I tried to do in the Le Monde Diplomatique. That's always what I try to do. Yeah. It's very difficult to write. You write anything, it'll be obsolete tomorrow.
Yes. And so maybe to sort of round up, Thomas, the essential thing is that we've been sort of discussing is the change in the complexion of the support base for the two key parties.
Yeah.
And that is also part of your recent book, which you mentioned a moment ago, which looks at how populism has become characterized as a purely right-wing phenomenon.
Yeah, isn't that weird? Well, actually, wait, you don't know this, but so I'm from Kansas. That's where that was populism's biggest state. These are the people who made up the word populism. They just made it up one day, and it was a very left-wing phenomenon. Knowing this, I know a lot about populism, the movement in the 1890s, the farmers' movement, and knowing that, and then watching the last few years as the news media and political science more generally, the discipline of political science, have been abusing the term in the way that they have as to describe this kind of proto-fascist mentality. It used to make me so angry. And so whenever I have that kind of, because I know what populism was, and whenever I have that kind of reaction, I have to write a book about it. And now I'm healed. Now I never get angry anymore. It's this total book therapy.
So that's a good policy. So I mean, to round up, what are you going to be watching particularly closely over the next month?
What
do you think? What are you really paying? I mean, I know we talked about this sort of wave of news that keeps coming, but
I don't even know what's going to come next. I mean, will Biden get sick? Biden does not look like a healthy man to me. Trump looks more robust, but they're both old. Trump is really overweight. Biden, at least we know he works out and stuff like that, but both of them are, highly vulnerable. Let's hope Biden goes back to his basement and stays there. And, I don't know I have no idea what's going to happen, but I think, all of these, so last week's worry before the taxes and before Trump got COVID, last week's worry was that he was going to do some kind of military coup, or that he was going to not respect the results of the election. That requires a strong, robust leader, not a man in a sick bed. So I think we can stop worrying. Oh my God! I almost said it. I don't want to say that because I never want to jinx it like that. If I say we can stop worrying about that, then it'll instantly be, the thing that we have to worry about. Look, I look at everything from a very long-term perspective. In terms of the election, what matters is these Midwestern states, the former industrial states, so Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and how well the Republicans do there. If the Republicans do well there, then it's game over for the Democrats. So the thing is that by all the ordinary standards, this should be easy for Biden to win. It should not even be close. But the pandemic throws everything into doubt. We don't know what the turnout is going to be. You talked about things that matter in American politics, who's unpersuaded. The biggest sort of X factor in American politics, the unknown, is turnout. So, for example, Hillary Clinton in 2016 was really uninspiring to Black voters, who are a huge part of the Democratic base, and they didn't turn out for her. And this is one of the things that caused her to lose in Wisconsin and Michigan and places like that. Well, will they turn out for Joe Biden? I mean, Biden certainly hopes so. Who knows? Will anybody turn out because of the epidemic? It's very frightening to go to a public place and stand in line for, however many hours. I'm going to do it. I've got my mask right over there, and I'm going to, I've got it all figured out. My wife and I are going to go down the first day of of advance voting here in Maryland, and damn it, I am going to vote in person, but lots of other people are doing these mail-in ballots, which is a recipe for, there's so many of them that all sorts of things could go wrong. When you fill it out wrong, or you don't sign it, or you put the wrong date on it or something like that. And so it's going to be a mess. The election is going to be a huge mess, and we don't know what's going to happen. And it could swing it in Trump's favor, and it could swing it in Biden's favor. And we just have no idea at this point. But my friends all think that it will be a litigated election, like the one in 2000. Right. Only instead of one Florida, there'll be like 3 or 4 Floridas. And I am not looking forward to that.
And Trump has certainly worked hard to erode confidence in the ballot, hasn't he? I mean,
he has, which is again, so unpresidential. It's shameful that U.S. So one of the things that I wrote in my Le Monde Diplomatique article is that the presidents, when I was a child, one of the sort of, you can despise Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or George Bush, or Lyndon Johnson, but they were very good at reassurance, at doing public reassurance. They'd go on TV in prime time and they would talk us down from whatever the panic was. Well, Trump doesn't do that. He does the opposite. He tries to make things worse. Or maybe he doesn't try, but he winds up making everything worse. And it's, for me, that is just unforgivable in a president. You know, I have a family. I have people I care about. And it's absolutely unforgivable for a president to behave this way.
He started in his inaugural address, didn't he, talking about American carnage? And
I thought that was actually...
He's kind of made it happen, but he's kind of made it happen.
You're right about that.
Program, fulfilled it.
So all the media, the pundit bureau, they hated that speech. But I've been writing about deindustrialization all my life and what's happened to the middle class way of life. And if you know anything about, the hinterland, like small towns in Missouri or Kansas or anywhere, what he was saying is true, that these places, these parts of America have been ruined. That is actually, he was talking about deindustrialization there, and it's true. I didn't vote for Trump, but he was, he's right that stuff has happened. And it was very telling to me that our flock of pundits universally panned that speech. They just hated it because he acknowledged that this is taking place. I mentioned how I look at things over the long term. The most deadly pandemic we've ever had was the one in 1918 and 1919. And ironically, it started in Kansas, my home state. The first recorded case was at Fort Riley, Kansas. This is during World War I. And so Fort Riley is the home of the 1st Army Division, I believe. That's where the first case happened. And then it spread through the soldiers all over the place, got to Europe, was on all over the Western Front, got over into the German army. It was everywhere. And President Wilson caught it. While he was at the Versailles Peace Agreement, I believe he was negotiating the Versailles Treaty. And these are disasters for America, by the way. The disasters for everybody. The Versailles Treaty, and for Wilson, Wilson wanted all these great things, and he got sick, and he didn't get anything. And then he went around the country trying to persuade the American public to buy it anyways, and join the League of Nations. And he had a stroke. And was like the last year of his presidency was in the sickbed and couldn't do anything. I think about that all the time these days. The last few hours.
I was talking to Thomas Frank about his article, America, the Panic Room, which is in the October 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. That article is available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources, such as maps, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.